Okay, so really what I'd like to do in this session is to cover two things. And when we start thinking about reading comprehension, it's about thinking about, of what? I mean, what do we mean by reading comprehension? But what are we actually, what things are we thinking about? Which obviously takes us to the text. And reading comprehension, well, by whom? Well, it's about the reader. So really what I'd like to do in this session is to think about the reader and the text. And I'm going to start off by thinking about the reader as a starting point. And then we'll come on to think about the text afterwards. And I think we need to start thinking about, the fact the cartoons around there you can randomly look at to see the fact that the nature of reading is changing. And when we start looking at Fiona's work and we start looking at films, we have to start thinking about, well, actually, they're all texts. These cartoons are texts. So how do we actually conceptualize what we mean by a text? So that's a starting point I'd like us to think about as we go through. But I just want to go back to, and as I said, there'd be one or two people who might have heard me speak before. I'm going to cover some aspects of reading which you might already know about. And it's the same jokes. So if you feel like unmuting and just laughing along as if you've never heard it before, that would be really appreciated. Okay, so right, okay. So I saw this article back in 2012, and it still makes me laugh. And it was in the Independent, and it was about baboons. And apparently, baboons are literate, according to this article. So John von Rodowitz was reporting about this study that was in Science, the magazine Science, and it was about French scientists were testing baboons on their ability to discriminate genuine words from non-words. And in this study, I've got the links there, but there are links actually on YouTube. You can see it, In this study, the baboons could tell the difference between real English words and non-words to about 75% accuracy. Baboons can tell the difference between real words and non-words to about 75% accuracy. 75% accuracy, real words and non-words. Wow. The phonics check essentially asks children to differentiate between real words and non-words. And in year one, they're doing it to about 80–85%. So at least our children can do it slightly better than baboons, which is good to know. But for me, this raises a lot of questions. Why are French scientists doing it in English? It doesn't make any sense to me. But also, when we start thinking about it, is this actually reading? Are they actually literate? Are they actually reading? Someone put something in the chat for me, and then with an explanation of yes or no. Or unmute, so I don't mind. I'm quite happy to go with either. Let's have a look. Probably not. Yes, so Joe, we're going into sort of, it's knowing what it means. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Reading, but not for meaning. Okay. It's word recognition, perhaps. Although we might start thinking, does word recognition assume knowing the meaning of the words or just being able to get the word off the page? If you go back to the simple view of reading, it is about context-free word recognition. It's not about understanding the word. It's just about being able to get the word off the page. So there's something here that we need to start thinking about in terms of what we actually mean by reading. And sort of going on from this and thinking about what is reading, what is comprehension. There's a piece of text for you. I'm hoping no one here is fluent in Swedish. Oh, that's good to know. Right. That's, what I'd like you to do is just basically, you're muted, so don't worry, but just read it out to yourself. Okay, so I'm sure we can get the words off the page. All right, so there's no two ways about it. We might get the pronunciation slightly wrong because you've got sort of accents over words and things like that, and umlauts and things. But basically, I'll just do a quick one just so we've got it in our heads. I'm not going to try and say it with any sort of Swedish accent because I'm not entirely sure what it actually sounds like. But det var en gang en ung kvinna som hette Lady Mary, som hade två bröder kallade Forbes och Edward. De båda tillsammans i det vilda gränslandet mellan England och Skottland. I ett fint hus som stod på en klippa med utsikt över havet. Okay, so well done me. I've got the words off the page. I can do that. But I would still say, is that reading? I'd say probably not. So I can, but I'm sure we're all able, with time, get the words off the page. Given that, let me check my understanding of it, because this is what we do with children, right? We check their understanding of it. So see if you can answer those questions for me. Have a little go. Just take a couple of minutes. And just to be clear, it's not a test. Oh, we're getting some good answers here. Okay. And what's interesting me looking at some of these answers, to our broader, which is just two brothers. England and Scotland is one of the answers, apparently. Okay. Clipper, Utsik over Havet. Okay. Forbes and Edwards. Okay. England and Scotland. Nice one, Joe. We're getting there, right? And really what you're doing is probably applying your grammatical knowledge of, well, understanding how grammar works. You don't know how it works exactly in Swedish, but you're applying something and you're able to get somewhere near correct answers. Okay, so for example, some of you, I think it was Joe, said basically, that var Lady Mary Broader Hetta, it's Forbes and Edwards, and it's the idea that you're probably looking for the word broader. Oops, sorry. You're probably looking for the word broader, and you've gone and you might have picked up that and got somewhere near it. Okay, some of you put to that one, but you're kind of near because you're looking at what the word broader might have meant. And the second one, Davet det wilde Gränslandet mellan England och Scotland. So you know it's something to do with England and Scotland. I think a lot of you might have got this one's right because it's a lot more straightforward. You've gone to where it says Wilda Gränslandet and you picked up the end of the word there. And you've all of a sudden, you know, we've got 2 out of 2. Well done. And the third one, Part and Clipper med utsikt over havet, as somebody said. So var stod det fina huset? Okay, and you've got the answer there. Potentially, we've got 3 out of 3. And yeah, we're starting to translate. Libby, nice one. She's got two brothers called Forbes and Edwards. And we can start working out. It is from the story in the top right-hand corner there, Lord Fox by Robert Knight. It's a kind of a gothic horror thing. It's quite good with year 6. But the point to be made here is that you've actually got 3 questions right potentially here. And if you haven't, you're not far off. So, you know, potentially I can go away from here and say, oh, well done, all these people. We've got 3 out of 3. Put it in a little book, collect a score, do all those kinds of things. But you don't really know what's gone on there. You're inferring a lot. You're trying to work out something. You're probably trying to translate certain things. And essentially what you've done is you've played the game. You know how the grammar works. You're kind of working at, well, the first question is going to be earlier in the piece and the last question is likely to be later. And you've worked through and you've got 3 out of 3. And this is what children are quite good at doing. If you give them a piece of text like this, not necessarily in Swedish, but in any other language, just to be absolutely clear, giving children a piece of text and questions to answer is not teaching. I didn't teach you anything. Where's the actual teaching taking place? That's an assessment. I'm making an assessment. And if I can use it formatively and say, well, you might have got one wrong there, let me go back and have a look at it and work on it, then maybe I might be starting to use it formatively and maybe thinking about using it for sort of developing comprehension. But as it stands, how much time do we ever have to do that in the cut and thrust of a classroom? So I think we already have to start thinking that, well, actually, being able to decode the text is a really important skill. I'm not going to sort of knock that at all, and I'm not going to knock phonics at all, because it's a really good way of getting the words off the page. But actually, it's clearly not enough. So we have to start thinking about, well, what does it mean to actually comprehend? And also we have to think about, if we get to this point, then what should teaching actually look like? Okay, what do we need to do to support children through that? So we start getting to this idea of what does it mean to understand. And this is a piece of text that you might have seen before. It's been attributed. Well, actually, well, I'll give you the attribution a bit later. So it's for sale, baby shoes never used. And we can look at that and we can start thinking, okay, so what's going on here? And if I say that allegedly it was said by Ernest Hemingway, we suddenly say, oh, it must be very literary. And we go, oh, the pathos, something terrible's happened, etc., etc. Okay, so but actually this wasn't probably Hemingway, because it did actually come out in 1910. Somebody found an article. So apparently Hemingway won a bet with all his fellow authors to write a 6-word story, and this is apparently what he wrote on a napkin. Well, this event clearly didn't happen, but this goes back because somebody was actually saying baby's handmade trousseau and baby's bed for sale, never used. So that's, and it goes back to 1910, as we said. So you probably never said that, but the point I want to sort of get across is that even with 6 words, you're actually doing a lot of things to try and make sense of it. And how do you understand it? So maybe we can assume something terrible has happened, but maybe not. It might be someone just selling something because a child's grown out of something. And we start thinking, oh, well, what do the shoes look like? Are they actual shoes, or are they something that you slip on to a child's foot? We presume that it's something that is being sold and not something for an area just outside Manchester called Sale. Right, so we make all these judgments as we go through, and even to understand these 6 words, and this is where it gets really interesting, because that assessment that I just gave you, if you like, in Swedish, where you got 3 out of 3, brilliant. we suddenly start taking this idea that perhaps things aren't as straightforward as we might think. So when we read text, when we ask children to read text, we are essentially doing the same thing. But for us, it is, if you like, a lot more automatic. But the same processes take place. So we have the linguistic processes. So we have to get the words off the page. We have to understand things like words like used, sail, all those kinds of things. It's not something you put in a boat, all those kinds of things. And we have to look at the word in the context of a sentence. So that's what we do every single time. So grammar is important for this. So for sail, you've got a colon, baby shoes never used, to understand how a colon's used, all those kinds of things. So one of the first things we need to do is look at the linguistic processes, looking at the words in the context of the sentence. But actually, simultaneously, while we do that, we're actually using a load of cognitive processes as well. Okay, and this is all happening in kind of milliseconds and seconds. So we've got to decode the text. Clearly, we've got to decode the text. We can use our phonics, we can use our whole word recognition. Are we allowed to say that? Well, I don't know. From what I'm seeing in what I've been told about fluency from some of the teachers that I work with, it's about understanding the orthography, which is actually essentially a whole word recognition. So it is part of it. So we have to decode the text while looking at the words in the context of the sentence. But we also have to apply memory. Okay, so we apply our working memory. We've got to keep it in our heads as we go along. Working memory is only a few seconds. It doesn't last very long. And we shouldn't have a problem with that with only 6 words. We can probably just we should be able to hold that all in. When you get longer text, we can't hold it all in working memory, and that's when we lose things, if you like. But we also have to bring long-term memory into play as well, because we've got to understand what we mean by sail. We've got this idea of baby shoes. I've told you it's to do with Hemingway, so you think it's literary, so you think there must be something quite sad about this or whatever. You start bringing all these different ideas. So you have to apply working memory and long-term memory while decoding the text, while looking at the words in the context of the sentences. While you're also doing that, we'll be looking at, you have to make a range of inferences. David's going to talk more about this later on, but you make inferences in many, many different ways, and it's probably the most under-theorized thing that we share with teachers. In my research that I've looked at, I've found 32 different types of inference. So it's not just about finding that bit of evidence in the text to answer that question on the page. We make inferences at the word level. Sail in Manchester, or a sail to do with something that you're getting rid of. Probably the latter. We do that, and we do that in milliseconds. We infer at the word level. We infer at the sentence level. The type of text in front of us, it looks like it might be an advert or something. So we use the grammar that's available to us to help us. Okay, we've got that, and we infer at the word at the if you like, the whole text level, which is like, okay, this might be a sad event, etc. So we're inferring at the word, sentence, and text level while applying long-term memory and working memory, while decoding the text, while looking at the words in the context of the sentences. Every time you give children a piece of text, this is what you're asking them to do. Every time you give them a piece of text, they're having to do this. It's not just us doing it as adults. But it doesn't end there, because there's a whole load of metacognitive processes going on. So textual understanding. Do they understand what type of text it is? Do they understand it as an advert or something that they might find in a newspaper? That's actually critically important. All right, so it takes us back to this whole idea of genre theory. It's all research. We read in different ways for different texts. So we've got to understand that there's a textual thing going on there. We have to wonder about their reading goals. Every time we read, we have a goal at the end of it, even if the goal is we're reading this for the SATs. That's your reading goal. At least be honest about it. So there's always a reading goal. And here, well, why are we reading this? I'm reading this, I've got 10 minutes before lunchtime, I don't want to go out and play. Or, you know, so all those kinds of things come into play, actually. So reading goals, and, you know, am I thinking of buying something, or is it a piece of literary text from Hemingway? All those things are important. It's different sort of things. Comprehension monitoring. Does it make sense as I'm reading? So there's this whole thing about tracking understanding as we read. I would argue children are not really very good at that. I think they lose it, and I think part of it is historic, because it's always about getting to the end of the text, right? When you get children to read to you as a teacher or whatever, the big thing is becomes a performance. You've got to get to the end of the text, and then you ask them, okay, so what happened? And they go, I don't know. Or they've got a partial view of something. Are they checking understanding as they read? As skilled readers, we do that all the time, and it's something that we need to teach children to do. Okay. In this example, I'll come back to sale in Manchester because it's just the easy one. For sale. Oh, it's for Manchester, is it? Oh, no, it can't be that. It must be for something that's selling something. Those are the kind of processes that you would be doing, particularly if I capitalize that S, you know, so that you'd be doing as a reader, and you're doing it in milliseconds, and you're asking children to do the same thing. Because essentially, if they're going to make sense, that's what they've got to do. You've got standards for coherence. How deeply do I want to understand this? Do I want to understand this deeply, or am I happy just with a superficial understanding for it? As I said, I've got to go out to play in 10 minutes. I'm really far more interested in that than listen to the big guy at the front waffle on a bit more. Okay, so how deeply do I want to understand what I'm reading? So, and again, it's something, it's a habit that we have to work on with children. So even at this stage, we can see we've got to be thinking, how deeply do I want to understand it? Is it making sense as I'm reading? Why am I reading it? What's my reading goal? What type of text is it? Because that's going to really help me understand it, because I've got to make a range of inferences at the word, sentence and text level while applying long-term memory and working memory, while decoding the text, while looking at the words and the context of the sentences. Every time I ask children to look at a piece of text, this is what I'm asking them to do. But it doesn't stop there. There's more. All right, there's knowledge bases as well. And obviously there's been a lot of work around knowledge at the moment, and people are looking at it. But actually, I think it's a lot more complex than we're trying to make it out. So in terms of knowledge bases, we apply our general knowledge of the world. Okay, there's something that we need to think about there. Every time we approach a text, we think, what do I know about this? And that might come from my general knowledge, but it might come from my experience. It might come from my experience. It's not the same thing. So I know that the highest mountain, tallest mountain in the world is Everest, but I've not been there. If I've been there, I can apply experience to it, gives me something different. That's absolutely fine. So there's two different knowledge bases that I can get to, and children have to do the same thing, or we should be encouraging them to do the same thing. I can also apply domain knowledge, my expert knowledge. What expert knowledge do I have in this particular area? So there's something around children also having expert knowledge. I know children who can tell me the top scorer for Plymouth Argyle for the currently at the moment, and how many points they've got in the league. It's all those kinds of things, because they're really interested in it, and that's expert knowledge. I know children whose fathers were mechanics, and they know all about how gears work and things like that. That's expert knowledge. Okay, it's real domain knowledge. So children can bring that to something as well. And then there's pragmatic knowledge. I could actually retitle that cultural knowledge. Knowledge doesn't exist in sort of facts. There's a cultural knowledge that we bring to situations. Even this situation of for sale baby shoes never used. There's a culture that we might feel sad about that, or something along those. It's coming from something there. Okay, we bring cultural knowledge. And any text we read, this is what we have to remember when we work with children, is that any text we give them is culturally located. There is no such thing as an acultural text. When you ask children to sit a SATs test with these texts in front of them, they're not neutral. right? They're culturally located, they're socially located, and they're historically located. And so immediately I have to ask myself, does the child know where this text is socially and culturally located? So there's a real problem there. And because what it comes down to is, can they infer? And this is why David's going to talk about that afterwards. It's that inference making is a singularly most important thing that we of all these. But basically, so when I'm working with children, when I'm reading myself, I'm thinking, what's my cultural knowledge can I bring? What cultural knowledge can I bring to this? Have I got any expert knowledge to think about this? Have I got any general knowledge that might be applicable? Are there any experiences that become important? And I'm thinking about that particularly. Myself and David worked with some schools up in Hull, and one of the teachers was telling me there was a SATS paper a few years ago about caving in Derbyshire. And her family's from Derbyshire and used to go caving all the time, and her sister did really well in the test. Surprise, surprise. So cultural knowledge, domain knowledge, general knowledge, and experience. Can I bring any of that? Because I've got to think about how deeply do I want to understand it. I've got to think about, is it making sense as I'm reading it? Because I've got to think about why I'm reading it, and I've got to think about what type of text it is, because I've got to make a range of inferences at the word, sentence, and text level. I've got to apply working memory and long-term memory while decoding the text while looking at the words in the context of the sentence. Every time I give children a piece of text, this is what I'm asking them to do. That's what's going on in their heads, or I want to activate in their heads. I've missed one out there, you might have noticed. Motivation. Given that they've got to do all that, can they actually be bothered? It's a reasonable thing to ask. So immediately you have to start thinking about the text that you're giving them. Actually, if it's a boring text, why would you be interested in going on with it, knowing that you've got to do all this? All right. So there's something really interesting here. So every time you give them a piece of text, that's what they've got to do. Aren't they wonderful? Aren't children amazing to be able to do this? And now we start thinking, well, when we look at this, if they are having a reading difficulty, or there's some sort of problem here, I can start thinking, well, what's the issue here? Because it might not simply be about decoding, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. It might be because they don't understand how the texts work. It might be because I've given them a boring text. They're not motivated. It might be because the knowledge is so far out of the realms of what they understand, they can't do anything more than infer. It might be because I haven't told them about the need to monitor their comprehension. It might be a vocabulary issue to do with words that I haven't pre-taught or something along this. And I keep saying this word that I haven't, because if a child doesn't understand the text, I've got to ask what my role in it as a teacher. It's not their fault. If they haven't understood something, it's not their fault. Something's going on here, and I've got to work out what it might be. Okay, got some couple of nice things here. Lynn, can you unmute and say, and mostly against their will with no agency over the text that they get given? Can you share that? What you mean by that?
Sorry, I was just thinking of the motivation, just the importance of like agency in motivation, because actually they get given, you know, we're doing a topic on this and the guided reading is on, I don't know, we had a guided reading on garden birds, and they don't we choose what we read.
Yeah,
I choose. I mean, apart from I'm doing a PGCE, so I don't always choose what I read at the moment.
No.
Generally speaking, but you know, I'm highly motivated because I chose to do it. But yeah, as adults, I don't read things I don't want to read.
Exactly. Isn't that an interesting point? Thank you, Lynn. That's really good. Yeah, you know, you don't want to read certain things, you know, as an adult. So yeah, and also you read certain things in different contexts. So there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to unpack this a little bit more as we go through. So, but the point is, all of this is going on as we read. And all of this is going on in children's heads as we read. So I think there's something about reconceptualizing how we think about reading and how we think about the teaching of reading. And if we think about conceptualizing reading, I'm hoping you can see why the simple view of reading is very, very limited. Because I don't believe it captures all this at all. All right, so I think there's something that we can sort of question about how reading is theorized in our as an important thing. Okay. So, and Yvonne's just said something about reading for enjoyment is an important element in the Scottish education system. I think that's in theory, it's in the curriculum here as well. I'm not quite sure, Yvonne, that it translates in the same way. I know that you've got something very different going on in Scotland, and I can pick up on some of that in a bit as well. So, okay. So, if we can think about these components of comprehension, this is kind of what's going on. We can't think of comprehension as one thing, and I want us to move right away from that. Okay, comprehension is not one thing, it's a number of components that work cognitively, metacognitively, linguistically, and in relation to our knowledge. And what the problem I've got as a teacher with 30 children in the class, they're all going to bring something different to each text. Okay, so what's the right answer? We start to wonder. But as our baboons here have worked out quite clearly with their study that they were doing, that the key thing is that putting a score to comprehension is of little value. Okay, so this morning when I asked you what those answers were, essentially I was wasting your time on a Saturday morning. Apologies. Putting a score to comprehension has little value. And indeed, you can ask about the SATs tests, because they said they only cover the bits that are that's measurable, and I don't even think they're even measurable. But why is it putting a score to comprehension of little value? Well, there is no uniform comprehension process to be measured, and that's Walter Kinch, who's the absolute guru on all this kind of stuff. A psychologist very much rooted in the cognitive and metacognitive side of work, and for him to say something like this is actually quite important, because there's, this is where kind of all the phonics stuff comes from. It's come from the psychological side of education, but there's no uniform comprehension to be measured. Okay, so this creates a problem for us, because then we start thinking, well, what does teaching look like, and what do we actually do? And I think there's one thing that's missing in all this, is this thing about the text. We have to start thinking this always takes place in the context of the text. What text are we giving them to actually read? Okay, so you can already immediately see, I hope, just looking at this diagram, that if you've got the text, if you can think of two different texts, immediately, if we've put text in the middle, well, immediately you've got different words going on. You immediately got different words to consider. The children have to engage with it. They're likely to have to make different types of inferences. Can they actually decode it? Is it easily decodable, or do they have to work a little bit at it? So there's something to think about there. What kind of knowledge are they bringing to the text as well? So this is how we're kind of reconceptualizing comprehension as a load of components that we need to consider as teachers, and from which I, as a teacher, can make decisions about where children's difficulties might be lying. And that's a really useful thing to do, because then I can do something about it. If I've just got a score on the page, I don't know what it means, because they might have used their grammatical knowledge to work out what was going on. Okay, so reconceptualizing the teaching of reading. Well, I would argue there are certain things that we know work in terms of things that we can do to support children in developing their reading comprehension. There are 200 of them, and I'm going to go through them all now. No, there's not. There's just those reading strategies. They're the key ones. Okay, these are the. If you look at all the psychological research and other such things, it comes down to about 7 strategies. And David's going to talk about questioning in a bit because it's the most important one. Questioning is the most important strategy that we can work with children. Summarizing, obviously important. Can you tell me what's gone on? And if a child can't do that, then you know that you've got to explore what's happened. Clarification of words. It might be a simple problem around words. Do I need to clarify words before they go charging on, or can I pick it up as they go through? Because, you know, learning how to infer what words mean isn't a bad skill to learn either. Predicting, yeah, okay. So the idea of familiarity with text, they can kind of predict what goes on. But of course, good writers mess up your predictions, don't they? Because they do sort of interesting things. Visualizing is really important. Can they, if they've written if they've read something, can they give you a picture of it? And what picture have they got in their heads? Can they actually share that with you? Even as a picture, frankly, they don't have to explain it. Can they share it as a picture? What's gone on there? Noting the text structures. Texts work in different ways. Okay, so again, we're talking historical texts work in different ways from literary texts. And that comes a bit later, sort of maybe towards the end of Key Stage 2 and into Key Stage 3. And thinking aloud. One of the things that's really good that's been shown to work is that if you ask children to read a short part of text and then cover it over or do something and just say what's happened in those few sentences. Because that's comprehension monitoring. You're checking that you're reading as you go along, but you're putting it in your own words, because in working memory, you're never going to be able to retain the whole text. We only do that for exams. Okay, and what are we looking as a result of that is, well, if you look at the curriculum in England, for example, I can't really comment on the one in Scotland. I'll have to look more into it. But you can reach all the outcomes of the curriculum if you get children to work with Robin Alexander's work on Learn-to-Talk. Can they narrate? Can they explain? Can they reason? Can they analyze? Can they speculate? Can they imagine? Can they justify? Can they negotiate with each other over what a meaning might, or how do we get to some sort of shared meaning? So basically, these are the kind of things that I'm listening for when I work with children. Can they do these things? Okay, so there's something around this, and immediately, and David will pick this up again, I think, as well, about the need to think about looking at a pedagogy of talk. It's got to be a dialogic interaction. So if a child actually says something to you, that on the page doesn't really help me. I need to know more. I need to know how they've come to that. Can they, and inevitably they will show reasoning, they'll show speculation and all those things. Okay. Kate, can you explain? Kate McCallum, I quite like this idea. Well, I'm interested in it. I'm just toying with it now. I know this would perhaps be a logistically nightmare, but a better indication of comprehension would be a child reading a text for SATs and then having a viva based on the strategies. From this, we could get a score. Potentially, yeah, there's potentially something there. But what I would actually say that the part of the thing around the score doesn't actually help anything, because again, you're looking for particular answers, and it suggests a mark scheme, and a child might come up with something that's reasoned, but you hadn't thought of. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, what I mean is we're kind of hung up on assessing children for them writing the answer. And the reason we do that is because it's practically impossible. It's logistically so hard, isn't it, to do it? But actually their verbal comprehension of a text, and as a professional, as a teacher, they could be asked broad questions. They could be asked the same questions, but then if the conversation went in a certain way, then I think as professionals, you will be able to work out how well they were doing that, how well they understood that text.
Yeah.
And yes, there have to be some questions with how subjective that was, and there'd have to be training around what was a such and such answer. But I think that gives so much more indication as to a kid's reading comprehension in also as a formative assessment. So which bit can't they do, which part, for us to make it, rather than just, oh, you're good at reading, you know, and then move on, as a formative assessment year on year, for them to actually have a conversation about the text. But I just think that that's statistically better, but doesn't happen because of logistics.
No.
I'm not about giving them a certain level, it's more about formative.
Yeah, formative, using it formatively. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Kate. And actually, you know, statistically, I'm sure statisticians will say, well, that won't work because you've got to have a definite answer. And that's quite an interesting thing that you're bringing up there, because actually, you know, like you say, if they're talking,
yeah,
they're how measurable is it? You know, there is that kind of thing. I mean, do we need to do that? So I think you've raised a really interesting point there to start thinking about.
Sorry. There's just a lot of work, isn't there, with you know, Voice 21 and Oracy and all of that coming through as well, that I think that we penalise the kids a lot of the time. Also their creativity, their answers, it's like a set thing of, you know, the P paragraphs that those enriched conversations can actually be had. And I think sometimes certain children are stymied a bit.
Yeah,
and also
absolutely.
gives us we can interrogate more. That sounds like a terrible word, but in order to get the best reading comprehension, you have to interrogate their answers.
Absolutely.
And it won't be superficial. We'll cut the fluff.
Yeah, absolutely. And David's going to talk about the questioning strategies we've been using with children, actually in projects across the country, to be honest. So, you know, that's that. So hopefully you'll find that useful, Kate. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just going to push on a little bit. Again, we've got this idea of text in the middle of it all. Okay, so within this, I'm going to ask them to do these different types of strategies, particularly around questioning, as I said, which David will pick up, and hopefully will answer some of Kate's questions, some of the things that she's raised just there, and thinking about, well, what am I actually listening for? I'm not listening for right answers, I'm listening for reasoning and other such things, okay? So, but the text within that is critically important. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some texts. I'm going to give you 3 texts. And these are 3 texts that I think are usable, or we are likely to see used in, or covered at least at some point by children in schools, similar to this. I'll read it out because I've obviously don't know if anyone's dyslexic or anything like that, so it just makes things a little bit easier, takes a bit of pressure off. This is the first one. Once upon a time, there were 3 children, Joe, Beth, and Franny. They lived with their mother and father in a little cottage deep in the country. They had to help their parents both in the house and in the garden, as there was lots to do. Now, one day, their mother had a letter. She didn't very often have letters, so the children wondered what it was about. Listen, she said, this is something quite exciting for you. Your cousin Rick is coming to stay with us. Ooh, said all the children, pleased. Rick was about the same age as Joe. Here's one piece of text. Let me give you another piece of text. It was market day, and all the animals were spending their wages. But Anansi was too lazy to work, and so he had no money. Those golden mangoes look tasty, he said to himself. And that round green watermelon. I would love to take it home for my family. Oh, life is so unfair. What can I do? Then he saw his friend Rat scurrying along. Rat was carrying a brown paper bag, and Anansi being a curious sort of spider, wanted to know what was in it. "Good morning, rat," he said slyly. "I see you have bought something in the market." Well, there's 2 stories I've given you, both about the first 100 words of the beginning of the stories. Here's a third one. CJ pushed through the church doors, skipped down the steps. The outside air smelled like freedom, but it also smelled like rain, which freckled CJ's shirt and dripped down his nose. He ducked under his nana's umbrella, saying, "How come we got to wait for the bus in all this wet?" "Trees get thirsty too," his nana told him. "Don't you see that big one drinking through a straw?" CJ looked for a long time, but never saw a straw. From the bus stop, he watched water pool on flower petals, watched rain patter against the windscreen of a nearby car. So there's 3 texts for you. Okay, what I'd like you to do is, just looking at those 3 from what you've heard, just spend a minute or 2 on this. Which one's kind of like, do you think is probably the most challenging? Or even the most interesting, whichever way you want to look at it. I'm just curious to know how you think these texts might be different. Got some lovely responses in the chat. Joe, sounds like Enid Blyton to me. Which one, Joe? First one. Okay. All right. All right. So that's fine. And we got some 3, 2, 1 in order of difficulty. Okay. That seems to be the kind of thing that's going on there. Okay. So there's something there. Because there's things that we can do with this. There's things that we can start looking at this, and there are ways to think about it. I'm possibly thinking, from what I've seen so far, you don't actually know what the stories are, which is good. Which means, you know, you've got some ideas about what they might be. So let's have a little look. Because what I did with these texts, because I really don't have a social life, I did something called a readability analysis on them. Now, a readability analysis doesn't tell you kind of a score for a child that's just about the text itself and how they've interacted with it. What a readability does is formula does it actually gives you an idea about how difficult the text might be to read. Okay, so it's before you even get to it, there are some things to think about. And so the one that's been shown to work pretty well with primary school texts is the SPACE formula. And it's in Colin Harrison's books, Readability in the Classroom, written a long time ago, but I tell you, it still works really, really well. And they're pretty accurate because I've been using them for quite a long time. And really what the SPACE formula looks at, it looks at the number of sentences. So you take the first 100 words and you look at the number of sentences, how long the sentences are on average of those 100 words, and how many unfamiliar words there are in that text. And there is a list, Dale's list of common words, which it's about 570 odd words. And if it's not on that list, then it's an unfamiliar word. Now, as you can see, 1974 is SPACE. Dale wrote his one, and I think in about the 60s. And no, I wasn't reading it in the 60s, just to clear that up. And so I think there's an element where it probably could do with a little bit of updating, but I still think there's something here. And there's a formula there that you follow: 0.121 times average sentence length plus 0.082 plus percentage of familiar words, plus 0569 plus 5. Now, you may not know what those numbers stand for, because I don't either, but the formula seems to work. It's one of these statistical things that no one's been able to give me a clear explanation of why those numbers are. But anyway, but it will give you a kind of readability in rough years and months. Okay, so that's the formula. And let's have a look then. Well, yes, number 1 was Enid Blyton. Okay, and it's a more modern version of Enid Blyton, if you like. By that, they've changed the names. You know, some of the names initially given were considered to be a bit rude in this day and age, or whatever. So I'm not even going to go down there. It is what it is. All right. So basically, when you look at the Enchanted Words by Enid Blyton, that's the first 100 words. You will basically come up with a reading age of 7.5 years. The Enchanted Woods is actually about over 200 pages long. It's a long book for children to read, and you know, Enid Blyton commonly read probably in Key Stage 2 by children on their own back in the day, maybe not so much now, I don't know, but you can see why they were able to get to the end of it, because actually it's got a reading age of 7.5. And when you start looking on certain websites like Goodreads and think, oh, my daughter's been reading it and she's 10, sort of thing. All right, so it kind of explains why that's the case. So reading these extended texts that might be 200 pages long, the actual difficulty in decoding isn't very difficult, but we could use it. The second text is Anansi and the 4 Bananas. And I actually got this from Read Write Inc. Okay, I actually got it from Read Write Inc. And just to be clear, the yellow words are the unfamiliar words that are not on Dale's list. And the reason I did that is that this is something that they are likely to read as they go through. Within this module, you do have this idea of like a piece of text with some questions to answer as you go through. So you can question that. I would question that. But they do give some vocabulary check. They check 4 words as a precursor to doing the work. Although I would question the definition of watermelon, and this is true, the definition of watermelon is big fruit. To me, it doesn't quite capture a watermelon, but that's where you go. And mango is a sweet fruit, I think it was. So, you know, we can question some of those definitions, which is why I'm going to stick with the 8.1 years, because I can't be sure. Because these are about words, not that you can get off the page, but you are likely to understand at these ages. Okay, so Dale's list is about word understanding. So we can see already that and one of my students gave me this actually. She's teaching in Key Stage 2 at the moment, in Year 2 at the moment. So they're dealing with a text they're in Year 2, but they're dealing with a text that's quite tricky, which is interesting in itself. Okay, so it's not necessarily an easy text to do. So you compare it to the first one, seems to be a little bit more difficult. The third one is from the book Last Stop on Market Street, and it's a picture book. It's a picture book by Matt Della Pena and Christian Robinson, and they won some sort of award, I think, in the States in 2015 on this text. And when you start looking at this text, you suddenly realize that there's a level of complexity, and I think a lot of you picked up on that in the comments. This actually, you know, there might be an interesting text to look at. There's something going on here. And what we see is that this picture book, according to the space formula, in the first 100 words, although it's not a very long text, has a readability, take the images out of it, of 8.6 years. So what we have are 3 texts here that we've looked at. The Enchanted Wood is about 7.5. The Anansi story from Read Write Inc. is about 8.1. And the only thing I'll say about that as well, we were talking with me and my students were talking about how, well, if you look at okay, it's a Ghanaian story, but generally came through to the UK through the Caribbean. And if you look at websites like Sacred Text and everything, you'll find it as actually written in a more of a Jamaican patois. So you kind of wonder, well, should we be anglicising it? And, you know, is that what a market looks like in Ghana according to the text? And you start thinking about why are they carrying around brown paper bags? Where's that been introduced from? So there's things there that are quite interesting to unpack, just even with that, about how things change culturally from one story to another. And I'll come back to the cultural part again in a minute. But Last Stop on Market Street is a picture book, and I'll show you what some of the pictures look like. Here we go. We can ask, sorry, David will do some work on you on question types, what we call looking, clue, and thinking. And you can use all of these texts to do that work on. You really can. There's no problem. You can apply the same. You can get children to make sense of text, asking the right questions with all of these texts, and you get to underlying understanding. And that's really, really important. However, I'm going to push for this last one. Okay, and I just want to focus on it a little bit. I'm going to give you the starting point. So, Last Stop on Market Street, and this is where it comes. This is where it comes from. That's the opening page, opening inside cover. There's not much to say about that one. It's not part of the story per se. It's not the written part that we've been looking at. So you can see where the character lives. All right, and here it is. CJ pushed through the church doors, skipped down the steps. The outside air smelled like freedom, but it also smelled like rain, which freckled CJ's shirt and dripped down his nose. Now, I bet you, if you've not read this before, you wouldn't have expected it to look like this. But it's just a picture book, right? Hugely complex piece of work. He ducked under his nana's umbrella, saying, "How come we got to wait for the bus in all this wet?" "Trees get thirsty too," his nana told him. "Don't you see that big one drinking through a straw?" CJ looked for a long time, but he never saw a straw. From the bus stop, he watched water pool on flower petals, watched rain patter across the windscreen of a nearby car, and that's where we got to for the first 100 words. His friend Colby climbed in, gave CJ a wave, and drove off with his dad. Now, how come we don't got a car? There's lots of stuff going on here. You can already start thinking about language and sentences. How can you start a sentence with watched rain patter against the windscreen of grammatically? That's incorrect, right? And you've got the child's voice, all those kinds of things. There's lots of stuff to think about here. And what they actually do, I'm just going to show you a couple of the images from this. They actually get on a bus and they go to another part of the town. And on this bus, there's somebody singing a song, and you get a sense of community on this bus, because they all seem to know each other, or certain people seem to know each other on this bus. And some guy with a guitar starts singing a song. And then you've got these beautiful, beautiful bits of writing here. And in the darkness, the rhythm lifted CJ out of the bus, out of the busy city. He saw sunset colours swirling over crashing waves, saw a family of hawks slicing through the sky, saw the old woman's butterflies dancing free in the light of the moon. There's an old woman on the bus. CJ's chest grew full and he was lost in the sound, and the sound gave him the feeling of magic. So you've got some nice text to work with there. I can really focus some work on that, because really, when I'm teaching reading, how much text do I need? If I'm doing a highly piece of focused teaching, working with chapters and chapters and chapters is very difficult, because they can't retain it in their memory. There's some beautiful stuff I can do there around there. And as they go on the bus, they go to another part of town, and you kind of work out it's where his nana actually came from. They've obviously moved. And it's not a nice part of town. CJ looked around as he stepped off the bus. Crumbling pavements and broken down doors, graffiti tagged windows and boarded up stores. Just a picture book, right? He reached for his Nana's hand. How come it's always so dirty over here? She smiled and pointed to the sky. Sometimes when you're surrounded by dirt, CJ, you're a better witness for what's beautiful. There's a lot going on here, and actually in the sky there's a rainbow. And eventually they make their way from this part of town over towards a soup kitchen. And they meet people that they know at the soup kitchen. And CJ basically says he's really glad that he came because he's meeting all these people again. And he thought his Nana might laugh, but her deep laugh, but she didn't. She patted him on the head and told him, "Me too, CJ, now come on." And that's the end of the story. Now this takes us down into something else, because I think there's this thing. I'm going to have a quick look in the chat. Yeah, this book is amazing. It's an amazing book. Yeah, just so much to explore on one page. Yeah, so there's so much you can do with this. You could do a whole lesson on one page on this, and hopefully David will show you afterwards. I'm really building him up here. So there's something to think about here with this, with the type of text that you're using here. And if we're saying that we need to teach children these sort of different skills and strategies and everything, why would we teach them something that's so far out of their experience? And I know we get this idea, we've got this, the curriculum actually says what's brightest and best in our culture. I don't know what our culture actually means. Okay, so is it one? Do we live in one culture? What are we talking about here? Accessibility for children, to give them the underlying skills and understanding of reading text that are actually going to stimulate them and actually that they can relate to in some way, I think is really, really important. And there's something here about how we can, another quick, last stop on Market Street, yes. So how we can theorize this? Well, I'm going to go to Bishop's work on mirrors, windows and sliding glass doors. And as Pardo actually says, comprehension is affected by a reader's culture based on the degree to which it matches with the writer's culture or the culture espoused in the text. So that interaction is not neutral. It can never be neutral. If we just throw any old piece of text at the children, then that doesn't necessarily help them. We have to think about the context of the text, the cultural context of the text, social and historical. Okay, but what she says with this is that mirrors, can the child see themselves reflected in that story? That's one option. Windows. Does it take them, does it give them a view on someone else's world? Okay, they're just looking in to somebody else's world. And sliding glass doors, or does it actually change the way they think and take them to another place? They go through the door into somewhere else. What are we trying to do? We've got some Bishop fans here. Fantastic. Thank you, Pauline and Lynn. That's amazing. Yeah. So what are we actually trying to do with this? And I think there's something where we also think about when we're thinking about who we are as teachers. What are we trying to do as teachers? What are we bringing to something here? So I'm saying that there's something here about, well, what do we choose texts that mirror the child, that they can actually get a gaze on the world, or take them to somewhere else? That's absolutely fine. But there's also something that you as a person are thinking about as a teacher, and you can't take yourself out of the interaction. Now, for me, an important part of what we do is about choosing texts that link to children, but also thinking about social justice. For me, it's important. I'm not saying it has to be for everyone, but this is what we start thinking about. And as a teacher in a primary school, I've got a control over the texts I use. I can fulfill that curriculum with loads of texts. Okay, I can reach it, but I don't. But I can actually do it with things that I think are important. So Jimenez has actually said, well, what do you need from a text if you're looking at social justice? Well, it must have authentic representation. Okay, it might show marginalized individuals living complex lives. I think that book, Last Stop on Market Street, does that. Okay, so it's got to be authentic. It's no hidden biases. No hidden biases, no perspectives about, you know, well, this is how certain cultures live. All right, so it's getting away from all those kinds of ideas. It must be relevant to the students in the class. It's got to be relevant. I mean, how can things like some of the themes in Last Stop on Market Street not be relevant today? I mean, I don't know which schools we work in and everything, but a lot of the schools I work in with, hunger was a really important part of children's lives. You know, they weren't rich. Poverty was an issue. It must promote deep engagement. And going back to the conversation I had earlier on, I can't remember who it was with now. It was a wonderful conversation where we were talking about, you know, engagement with children and going deeply. You can only go deeply through talking. That's why discussion is critical. And also, yeah, it's got to address literacy skills, but you can do that. You can do that with this text. And so the point here is that you can take any of those three texts and actually you can do the curriculum, but actually you can do a lot more. And when you start looking at a text like this, you suddenly realize, well, actually, it's a lot more complex, even in the words that it uses. And that these texts that might be promoted here and there, they're actually not that difficult, or they're comparable in terms of difficulty. You don't need much text, and you can choose quality text to do it. And I'm just going to finish off with okay, would I say that there's hidden bias in the SPASH analysis? Only in, I wouldn't say, yeah, there is, because of the lists they use. So the lists will be culturally located. The Dale list is obviously culturally located. Edgar Dale was a male educational academic who was white. So he's looking at texts from a particular time. So yes, certainly there's obviously hidden bias in there completely, but actually, if I'm even within that, I can make an argument for using these texts. Really good question, Lucy. I really like that. Really, that's smart. That's a really smart question. So just to finish off, I'm just going to think about this, about, you know, well, why are we teaching? This is something that's just important to me. It's something from Chaim Gino, Teacher and Child, and I'll read it out to you because I just think it's interesting. So what's our moral purpose for being a teacher? I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers. Children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses. Women and babies shot by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is, help your students to be human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, or educated Eichmanns. Reading and writing and spelling and history and arithmetic are only important if they serve to make our students more human. Thank you. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, we're going to make a start again. I hope everyone can hear me. And what we're going to do is during this session over the next hour is to take you through and look at very carefully one of the key areas in terms of reading comprehension, and that's inference. What we're going to do is we're going to go very quickly through making sense of a particular short text to demonstrate the key and central importance of inference making, and then we're going to get into the key strategy, some of the key strategies, but particularly the key strategy of questioning, and the way that Wayne and I and a few others have worked on developing 3 key questions, as well as the importance of not just asking the questions, but developing conversations from those three key questions. And we're going to have a look at some of a few texts and the kinds of questions we might ask to develop inference making through that questioning. So what we're going to do to start with is I'm going to show you a short passage. And I want you to think about the first word in the passage is there within the quotation marks. And once you've read the 2 sentences in the passage, to think about what you think that word means, and put it into the chat. What I'm going to ask you to do, though, is if you already know what that word means, please stay out of the chat until the end. You can just sort of sit back and feel fairly smug that you know what that word means, and other people at the moment don't. Okay, so I'm going to put the passage up. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to read this, and then to put into the chat what you think that word might mean. Over to you. All right, great. Some ideas coming through. Oh, right, Pauline, you said it's are you saying it's an armadillo? Pauline, can you unmute yourself so we can have a conversation about that idea? Is that possible? If you don't want to, don't worry. We'll... Hi, Pauline.
Hi. Yeah, that was just like
Right, tell me how did you, because there's all sorts of interesting things going on in that answer that you just gave me. How do you know it's a thing? You said it's an armadillo. How do you know it's a kind of it's a living thing?
Because it says that they eat. That makes me think it's living. And it also isn't the word. I thought it's maybe an animal that's not familiar in the UK.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you've taken some of the clues in the text, but you're also bringing some of your background knowledge to the text. So tell me that you don't think it's an animal found in the UK.
Yeah.
What do you base that on? Why do you think it's not an animal that you might find in the UK?
Just because I hadn't heard of the word before.
Okay.
And also, I think something about the way the word's written as well. I don't know, it sounds foreign in some way to me, an unusual word for English. Sorry, it's a complete guess, so I'm kind of...
No. But it's not a complete guess. It's based on your knowledge of, first of all, your background knowledge about animals. Secondly, your background knowledge about language. You're saying that word doesn't look like a word in English, so maybe it's from it's a word in another language which is overseas somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. What else do you know about armadillos that there are clues in this text that help you to come to
That they are nocturnal and that they live in holes, and and that the kind of the diet. Though I'm not an expert, that's kind of what came to head when I saw that what was described as their diet, the worms
absolutely.
and millipedes, insects.
So the key question then becomes, how do you know that the second sentence is connected to the first sentence?
Because it says they. Right.
So you're inferring here that the pronoun they refers back to the noun, the first word in the first sentence, which we haven't pronounced yet, of course. Now that's an inference. That's a really important, one of the most crucially important inference is to link pronouns with nouns, because pronouns in themselves have no meaning. They only mean something in relationship to the noun. So we also infer that the sentences are linked to meaning to each other. So as we read down the text and we add each sentence, we add meaning to the whole thing, and so we infer that the sentences themselves are connected in some ways beyond just making connections between the nouns and the pronouns. And you're also in. It's all right, Pauline. I've finished with you now, so you can mute yourself. We are also bringing all sorts of interesting background knowledge to this, as Wayne described in his diagram very powerfully, that background knowledge makes a difference. And we're also looking across the text for clues and information in the text to go together to infer the gist of the whole thing. And your overall inference was that this conclusion through your inferences was that this creature could possibly be an armadillo. You're also using your knowledge of grammar, because you immediately identified the keyword tuatara as a noun, and which goes with the verb which is next to it, and therefore there's that connection there. So grammatical, the grammar, grammatical knowledge is really important here. But I picked up on Pauline because she said she thought it might be an armadillo or something like that. Other people have said a mole or a badger. So it's the same text, but they're building a different picture in their head, probably based on the kind of background knowledge that they are bringing to this text, that you're inferring about making meaning about this text from background knowledge. Again, that kind of pragmatic and knowledge that Wayne was talking about. Now, the second question I want to ask you about this is, do you think this is true? Or probably a better question is, as you read this text, did you think it was true? And are you now thinking, hang on a minute, is this a trick question? Is he fooling us with this? Now, the assumption I'm sure most of you made that while you read this, as you read it, you thought it was a true information text. You were bringing your knowledge of text to this, and you made an assumption that it was probably true. Well, it is true, and I'll show you a picture of one of these creatures in a moment. There are a number of things in this text too that also is another key element in terms of inference making, and that's a word like emerge. When you look at that word emerge, we begin to build, we kind of elaborate around that word, and we kind of build a picture in our head of what we think emerging from the burrow actually might look like at night. So we're doing that as well. So there's some, as we fill in the holes in this text, we fill in the gaps in this text through inference. We're doing it in a particular way, drawing on all those kinds of different inferences. And one of the key things is, as we've seen from your responses in the text, that not everybody is making, building a picture of what this creature might look like or be in the same kind of way and coming to slightly different conclusions. As a teacher, I don't know what's going on in your head and the sense you're making of this until I ask you. And that's why conversation and interaction between a teacher and pupils is so important. How do I know what's going on in your head? How do I know what sense you're making of this without actually getting you to tell me about the sense that you're making about of this text? So, does anybody know what one of these tuataras actually is? If you do, just whack it in the text very quickly. No, okay, right, fine. There's one. That is a tuatara. It comes from New Zealand. So it's a creature that lives in New Zealand. It does all those things. And of course, tuatara happens to be a Maori word. So those of you who assumed that it wasn't a creature that was found in the UK, based on your knowledge about, broadly speaking, about language, absolutely right. So what we've been doing there is we've been demonstrating the crucial importance of inference for meaning making across the text and getting the gist of the text as well as anything. Because inferences are essential to make sense of the text we read. We can't have comprehension without inference, and all texts have gaps, and inference is needed to fill those gaps. So we need to be thinking about how do we go about developing inference making as if it has that central importance with our children in our classrooms. And what we've just demonstrated there is how the main types of inference are really important in doing so. As Wayne, as he said earlier on, has identified in his looking at research 32 different types of inference. And actually, you can boil them down to 5 key types here. We used all of those as we made sense of the tuatara text. We've got text-based, the evidence is in the text, and the reader looks for the clues. That's broadly speaking what people have always thought of as inference, but actually it's much more than that. Because we have anaphoric inference, and that's the inference where we link nouns to pronouns. And that kind of inference demonstrates that you can't even make literal comprehension of text without using inference. It's absolutely crucial to get the gist of it. We make connections between sentences, so there's connective-based inferences. There's elaborative inferences that flesh out our picture of the text. So if I say a character is handsome, I've got I elaborate on that in my own head about what I think a handsome chap might look like. I'm sure that your picture in your head about what a handsome chap looks like will be completely different. And so that comes from experience, it comes from age, it comes from cultural background, and it also means that again, it's that point that we don't know how children are elaborating using elaborative inference and the kinds of things that they are picturing unless we ask them. And then, of course, there's wider knowledge, bringing our knowledge from outside the text, including from other texts to the text. I think this slide is essential teacher knowledge. It's really important that we as teachers know about these 5 kinds of inference, because the conversations that we have with children around text should be about how we are developing these key types of inference making. And if we are confused or slightly unsure about why particular children don't seem to be making sense of the text in front of them, then it's likely to be that one of these types of inference making is not working very well. And so we need to identify that, and then we need to be kind of working on it. It may be that may have some children who are still at early stages of English as an additional language, and therefore they're not making the connection between nouns and pronouns in the text, and that's actually getting in the way of them making sense. So we then have to explicitly teach about the link between nouns and pronouns across the text. We might draw arrows in the text to show them where those links are being made, in order to then deal with what seems to be the issue in terms of making sense of the text. And we used all of those. We used text-based, we looked across the text. We used anaphoric, we made the link between tuatara and they. We elaborated, we've got words like emerge, burrows, and so on. So we used elaborative inference to do that. We connected the information across the two texts. We inferred it was linked to each other, and we brought our wider knowledge to this text. And I think one of the other things, again, Wayne made this point too, is that when we're working on inference making and demonstrating to children what we do as readers, as we inference make, if you like, short texts are actually quite useful. You don't need long text to do that, to do the teaching and the thinking about what it is that we do, as that we need to do in order to make sense of the text that we have in front of us. I find this definition of reading quite useful. It's getting on a bit now, and it does have gaps in it. It doesn't really address the issue around reading on screen and 21st century literacy practices, but I think it's quite useful. And again, it touches on Wayne's diagram that we saw earlier on in the day. So it's a complex, reading is a complex system of deriving meaning from print and other texts that requires all of the following: development and maintenance of a motivation to read. So reading for pleasure, engagement in reading, absolutely crucial. Appropriate active strategies to construct meaning from print. Again, although Wayne didn't make this point, one of the most powerful points that Wayne makes in his presentations is that you cannot teach comprehension. Comprehension is an outcome. What you can do is you can teach the strategies that help children and adults to make sense of the text, and then therefore to comprehend it. Sufficient background information and vocabulary to foster reading comprehension. That's really important too. I'm not going to touch on the background information bit today, because I want to work on the questioning. But one of the things that children may not be making sense of a text is because they haven't got sufficient background information and or experience to bring to that text to make sense of it. So it may be that we just have to junk the text for a while and go back and do something practical, or go on a visit, or go out into the playground and do some looking around before we come back to the text, and then bring that experience and information back to the text and have a look at it again. And then we got phonics and decoding unfamiliar words which are not phonically regular, and fluency at the bottom. I have to say, I think those 6 elements there are they're the basis for any reading curriculum. All of those elements have to be within a primary school's reading curriculum. If they're not, then we're missing it out. They're all essential. It seems to me. So, what are these active strategies? Wayne's talked about these already, so I'm not going to go through that list. The first 4, I think, are pretty familiar to most people. But as Wayne said this morning, questioning, I think, is the most important. The questions we ask should be designed to develop those key types of inference. And in guiding readers' layers of meaning, which Wayne and I and Nikki Gamble and Angela Hobsbawm wrote a couple of years ago, we've said that actually we need to think about 3 key areas in terms of comprehension and the inference making that goes into those 3 key areas. So we've got literal comprehension and anaphoric text-based connected, broadly speaking, are the ones that are the main ones that lead to literal comprehension. Connections between the text, so within the text, sorry, connectives, text-based, elaborative, that they're all kind of involved there, and connections beyond the text, so wider knowledge, elaborative mainly, but some of the others come into that too, making those connections beyond the text. So if these are the 3 key areas, then we need three types of questions. So we've called these looking questions, clue questions, and thinking questions. So looking questions address literal comprehension, i.e. getting the gist. Clue questions promote the seeking of evidence from the text, within the text, so they're making connections within text, and making connections beyond the text is the basis for thinking questions. These questions are the starting point for longer conversations. It's not ask the question, get a single answer, but they are the beginning of an exploration. They're the beginning of a conversation which is going to go over lots and lots of responses and responses to the responses and so on. And so what we need to think about as we're devising these 3 questions is, 1, is it going to lead to a useful and effective conversation which is going to develop those particular kinds of inference? And where am I going with this? We need to be thinking about where we're going once we've asked the question, broadly speaking, because actually once we've asked the question, we don't quite know what the response is going to be. So we've got to be ready for that. And then it's, how do I respond to the, how am I going to respond to the kinds of responses I think I might get? So looking questions, and I've got some very basic kind of ones, are very straightforward. What house did the big bad wolf blow down? Now you might think this looks like a retrieval question. And you'd be right to begin with, but it doesn't stay as a retrieval question. It's the beginning of a longer conversation. What house did the big bad wolf blow down? You might get a response. Oh, the stick house. Okay. And what did he do? Was that the only one, or was there one before that? Oh yeah, there was one. And what happened and who was living in the house? And what happened when the big bad wolf blew? Do you see what I mean? So I'm checking here. Have the children in front of me kind of got the gist of the whole of the text as a whole? Not every single detail, but broadly speaking, they've got the kind of gist of it. Because if they haven't, then I'm going to have to go back and think again about that text and about how I'm going to approach that text. Because if they haven't got the gist of the text, they haven't got a literal kind of overview of it, there's no point in going on to the next type of question. So clue questions, the evidence is available in the text, and the key kind of response is, how do you know that? So good old Farmer Duck, you said the farmer in Farmer Duck is selfish. How do you know he is? How do you know the Cyclops isn't clever? So it's, and what you're looking for with a good clue question is there's more than one clue in the text that you can draw on. So you can have you can have a kind of conversation. How do you know that? Where is it in the text? Is there anything else? Well, what about that? And then thinking questions require the readers to put the evidence into a wider context. So again, if you're looking at Greek myths here, do you think Odysseus and his men should have gone into the Cyclops' house and eaten his sheep? Or we might come right out of the text and explore some kind of moral conundrum. One should always tell the truth, agree or disagree, and then back into the text because maybe somebody told a lie or told the truth and it didn't work very well in the text. And then we can come back into the text. Or we put the children, or we put the children into the text. If you were the king, what do you think you would have done? Would it have been the right thing to do? Or we might be asking children to encourage them to make links between texts. Does this story remind you of anything, or any other story that you know? In what ways? Oh, it's got the same characters, and what does the character? Is there any kind of commonalities in terms of this character and his or her behaviour in the text? Yeah. So here's a text, and I make this. I choose this because it's short and it's got some interesting vocabulary in it. But here's a short text, and here are some questions to go with it. So just to show you what these questions might look like. What frightened Miss Muffet? What would Miss Muffet do if she saw a mini beast running up her bedroom wall? And why do you think little children like this rhyme? So there you go. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. Just to see, so you can see what's going on. Okay, so if we start with what frightened Miss Muffet? What are you going to say? Yes, straightforward. But I'm not gonna leave it there. Because exactly what happens in the class, a child will say a spider, and I say, oh, okay, yeah, and where was this spider? It sat down beside her. Oh, right, so it was quite near, was it? Because I'm trying to establish some key things that have happened. And what kind of spider was it, do you think? Oh, it was a big spider. Okay, so because that's quite important. I want to establish this stuff, and then I think so. There's a and what was Miss Muffet doing when this spider frightened her? Oh, she was sitting down, and then we've got and what was she doing while she was sitting down? Oh, she was eating stuff, and then we kind of get this what in the strategy is called clarification. You've got a couple of things here, tuffet and curds and whey, which are likely to be unusual or unknown by the children. Now, the first thing you're going to do is, for me, is clarification, working out what unknown or unusual vocabulary is, doesn't start by going to a dictionary. It starts by looking in at the context that the word is in. That's first and foremost. What are the clues in the text of what these words might mean? Do we have to have an exact definition of curds and whey? I don't think you do, but what you do need to do is to say, actually, there's a clue in the text as to what curds and whey is. Well, you eat it. So the verb is the clue. Do we need to go into the detail of the cheese making process? Possibly, but possibly not with young children. Tuffet, what's a tuffet? It's something you sit on. That's probably enough in this instance. Then we come on to the second question. What would Miss Muffet do if she saw a mini beast running up her bedroom wall? Well, you might think there's probably only one clue in here, that she'd probably run away. Because she's frightened, and I would say that's what children say. They say, oh, she ran away. I say, well, why would she run away then? How do you know she'd run away? Well, because she's frightened of spiders. Yeah, okay, so she's frightened of spiders. But if it wasn't a spider, it was some other kind of creature running up the bedroom wall, like a fly or something. Do you think she'd still do it? Well, maybe not. Or if she had a big bedroom, and the mini beast was right on the other side of the room, would she still be frightened? Well, maybe not, because it was right next to her. The spider was right next to her, and it was a big one, and that's small. So we've got some interesting things there to continue the conversation, and I've kind of thought this through beforehand. So I'm working through this. And then, why do you think little children like this rhyme? And you get lots of interesting, well, certainly with slightly older children and I've done this with in early key stage 2. They will say things like, oh, because they can relate to it because they might be frightened of spiders as well, or they think it's funny. They might find it funny, and so you can explore. Do you know any other rhymes like this which children like, and you begin to make connections in that way, as well as sort of drawing on their understanding of the way nursery rhymes work with young children. And I get some lovely kind of responses like, you can learn it off by heart really easily, and it sounds good and it rhymes. So there's lots of things to explore there and make connections with other rhymes. So we can do that. And when we're thinking about, say, narrative, we can come up with all sorts of questions that kind of fit with different elements of narrative. So you can have looking questions like, how many animals did the wolf eat in the story? What were they, and so on. Can you think of a word that describes what this character is like? How do you know? Did so-and-so do the right thing? Why not? So again, drawing on elements, sort of moral elements. In setting, looking question, what places does the story happen? Sorry about the typo. Then when does the story happen? What are the clues to when the story is set? And what do you think would change if the story was set today? So again, a thinking question. You've got to draw very heavily on knowledge and understanding of the world and make those links in order to kind of think about that. And plot, what happens in this part of the story? How does the story begin then? It's both kind of looking questions there. Is it like any other stories, how? So again, a combination of a kind of clue and a thinking question. What's the problem that has to be sorted out in this story? Would you have sorted it out in a different way? What would have happened if the character had done that? So kind of, we're still in the story, but we're getting children to sort of bring their own ideas about what they would have done, but then thinking about consequences. What are the consequences in the story? So that thinking question, it's not philosophy for children. So you might go out of the text and sort of talk about some moral conundrum, but then you have to bring it back to the text to help you to understand the text a bit more deeply. Okay, so I'm going to see if what I'm going to try and do now is to screen share a different thing, and I'm going to read you a story, hopefully. Here we go. So here's The Lion's Den. This is a story called The Lion's Den. It comes from a book called Short by Kevin Crossley Holland, full of brilliant short stories like this. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to think about what 3 questions might you ask about this text. So the looking question, the clue question, and the thinking question. So here we go. The Lion's Den. The king of the animals called a meeting in his den. Order, he shouted. Order. Then all the trumpeting and baying and croaking and barking and hissing and laughing and whistling subsided. That's quite enough of that, said Lion. Right. First item on the agenda. Does my den smell? Smell? Said Skunk. Everything smells, said Owl. How does it smell? Said Lion. How does it smell? To tell you the truth, Lion, said Dog, and not to beat around the bush. To come straight to the point of the matter, get on with it, said Lion. Not too good, Lion, said Dog. In fact, it smells something terrible. How dare you? Roared Lion, and he tore the honest dog to pieces. Then the king of the animals glared at all the creatures in his den. All right, he growled. How does my den smell? Like mango blossom, said Monkey. Your den, it smells like a dream of paradise. "You liar," roared the lion. "You deserve the same fate as the dog," and he tore Monkey to pieces. "What about you, Fox?" asked Lion. "How's my den smell?" "Ah," said Fox, and he sniffed. "Oh, if only I could tell," he said, and he sneezed. "Achoo! If only I could get rid of this dreadful cold." Right, just have a think about what questions would you ask about that? Yeah, I'll leave that up, but I'll put some of the other questions that I put up in a moment. Just have a think about that. You might just want to generate some questions. If you're with somebody else, that's even better. But just sort of note them down on a piece of paper, not necessarily on the chat just yet, and just think about. And then we'll think about whether we can categorize them in those different ways. Yeah, some examples there. Right, let's go back to the text. Right, here we go. Let's have a look. Oh, right, some lovely questions. Good. People are beginning categorizing. Right. Yvonne has asked for her looking question, why did the lion call the meeting? That's a really good starting point. So we've got, why did the lion call the meeting? And it's quite an interesting one. Actually, you could have that as he called the meeting to ask whether his den smelt or not. And then you might say, is that all what, and who was at the meeting? And then you might ask the same question as a kind of a thinking question, mightn't you? Why do you think the lion really called the meeting? What's he trying to, what do you think he's trying to do here by doing what he does? So is there a hidden reason, do you think? So it's it's a really interesting question, that one, I think. Yeah, who's in the meeting? And that's a really interesting one, because when you ask, as I do, this goes down a storm in Key Stage 2 classrooms, this story. When you ask it, when you ask that question, who's at the meeting, children say something like, sorry, I'll just get that one back up again. They say, oh, the lion's in the meeting, and there's a dog, and there's a monkey, oh, and there's a fox as well. And then you say, is that all? Is there anybody else there? And they say, oh, and they say, oh yeah, skunk. And inevitably they miss that third sentence about trumpeting and baying and croaking and barking and hissing and laughing. And so it's a short text, but it's actually got some really interesting things to explore, both at the literal level and beyond. So what else have we got down here? Yes, what do you think beat around the bush means? What's quite interesting there is what we haven't done, and I would do if I was doing this as part of a particular pedagogical process, that we haven't gone through it and looked at some of the and done some clarification and looked at some of the interesting words in it, like agenda, for example, is one that I would look at. But if you were looking at sort of colloquialisms and things to do, or even things like simile and metaphor, but in this case, beating around the bush, that's an interesting one to clarify and to talk about and to think about, because I don't think young children, 7 to 11-year-olds use that term "beat around the bush." It's quite an old-fashioned one. Anyway, so there's some interesting and lovely questions that you're asking there. I'm just going to show you, as time is moving on quite rapidly, and I want to do I want to just show you the 3 questions that I use when I'm working with this text. What is the meeting about? So we've had a few of those from yours. So we've talked about that. What's the meeting about? Is it really about that? Is there anything else going on? The word agenda might assume there. Who's at the meeting? What happens to the meeting during the meeting, and so on. And then the clue question is, which animals do you think are clever? And immediately, again, when you do this when I do this with children, they say the fox. And you say, okay, why, how do you know the fox is clever? And so they'll talk about what's the evidence in the text about this. And then you say, yeah, but are any of the others clever? And they might say, well, and they do say, well, the monkey tries to be clever, but it doesn't kind of work, and certainly in terms of the outcome. And then you might drawing, well, what about, let's have a look at some of what the others say. So what about the skunk? Why does the skunk say that? And what about the owl? What happened? And they say, oh, the owl said that. And yeah, what happened to the owl then? Nothing. Oh, well, maybe that was quite a clever answer. And then I might say, okay, well, given all of that, who do you think is the cleverest? Yeah. And so we might talk about who we think is the cleverest, and usually they go for the fox, although we don't quite know what happens to the fox, because the story stops annoyingly, in my view. And then should we go out of the story? Should we always tell the truth? I do this when I'm working with 7 and 8-year-olds on this story. I usually ask, and they always say yes. And then we say, well, okay, what? Why? And we kind of explore that a bit. And then we come back to the story, and I would say, well, the dog told the truth. And what happened to him? And do you think, and so we talk about that a bit, and then I might say, well, do we think that the fox is telling the truth? I wonder if he really had a cold. And so we might explore that a bit further in that way. So quite straightforward in that sense. But I want to come back to what I've been doing is giving you some texts which are, in a sense, quite straightforward, although they do have depth. But I want to come back to this text of Last Stop on Market Street, and I want to get you thinking about what questions for this text and why, because actually it's got different themes running through it. And it's got some interesting things to explore. And that's what I want, you know, so when we choose texts like Last Stop on Market Street, I do think we need to think about how we explore some of the things that and the themes that are going on in this story, because they do address issues around social justice, they do address issues around language, as well as they address, it's a beautifully written story, a beautifully written and illustrated story. I'm going to whip you through this. Wayne took you through the first, most of it, and this bit, and saying goodbye to his friend, and he says, "Nana, how come we don't got a car?" And they get on the bus. The bus creaked to a stop in front of them. It sighed and sagged, and the doors swung open. "What's that I see?" Mr. Dennis asked. He pulled a coin from behind CJ's ear, placed it in his palm. Nana laughed her deep laugh and pushed CJ along. And here they are meeting the people on the bus who they seem to know. The man across the way was tuning a guitar. An old woman with curlers had butterflies in a jar. Nana gave everyone a great big smile and said good afternoon. She made sure CJ did the same. The bus lurched forward and stopped. "How come we always got to go here after church?" CJ said. "Miguel and Colby never have to go nowhere." "I feel sorry for those boys," she told him. "They never get a chance to meet these people." And CJ stared out of the window, feeling sorry for himself. He watched the cars zip by on either side and watched a group of boys hop curbs on bikes. A man climbed aboard with a spotted dog. CJ gave up his seat. "How come that man can't see?" "Boy, what do you know about seeing?" Nana told him. "Some people watch the world with their ears." "That's a fact. Their noses too," the man said, sniffing at the air. "That's a mighty fine perfume you're wearing today, ma'am." Nana squeezed the man's hand and laughed her deep laugh. So I think that's where I would stop. You could stop at any of these pages and at double page spreads and or in the book and go into it in depth. But I'm just thinking about, if I'm reading this story with a group of children in probably 9-10-year-olds and up, I'm not going to do the whole thing all in one go. I'm going to do a part of it. Now it might be just a couple of pages. I might be working with this over a few sessions, but I looked at this and thought I'm probably going to do it in 2 sessions. So we've read together the first bit. We've done some thinking about this. We're talking a bit about, you know, what's going on, but there are a couple of things that I want to explore. And so first of all, I'm going to have a look in question like, what happens to CJ and Nana in the first part of the story that we've looked at? So I make sure that they've got the narrative going. I also want to explore, where is this story set? Where is it taking place? How do we know? Yeah. And one of the things I want to explore here is the language that's being used, and CJ's language. Why is he speaking like that? Well, because it's probably set in the USA. and that different people speak in different dialects, and there are different ways of speaking which are all equal, and it kind of begins to think about the quality of language, the different structures of language, and the way that language varies across time and place and location. And then I've got, what do you think is the feeling, atmosphere, theme that the author is creating this first part of the story? How do you feel as a reader as you're thinking about this? What's going on here? I want to get from the children themselves what they think is happening, and how the characters are feeling. The feeling on the bus for me is really positive. There's lots of interesting people there. They're all doing something which is they're all sitting there, all doing the same thing. They're traveling to a particular place, but actually there's a beginning of a feeling of community. But that's what I think. But in a sense, it doesn't matter what I think, although I'm kind of broadly speaking, thinking about where I might be going. But I'm waiting for what the children think here and how what they think is going on. And then I'm going to go. In the second session, I'm going to then read the rest of the story with them. And this beautiful page. And in the darkness, the rhythm lifted CJ out of the bus, out of the busy city. He saw sunset colours swirling over crashing waves, saw a family of hawks slicing through the sky, saw the old woman's butterflies dancing free in the light of the moon. Song ended and CJ opened his eyes and everybody clapped. Last stop on Market Street, Mr. Dennis called. And there they are. And Wayne's been through this page with you. And on they go, perfect rainbow arching over their soup kitchen. He wondered how his Nana always found beautiful where he never even thought to look. So even that one. Familiar faces. And there they are at the end. So what questions in the second part, and why? I mean, my time is coming to a close. So where did CJ and Nana go? That gives me, we need to think about, because we need to unpick what is a soup kitchen? How do CJ's feelings change in the second half of the story? Or do they change? So we look for what's going on in the first and the second half of the story and the evidence for that. And then why do you think there are soup kitchens? Should they exist? Yeah, we know what soup kitchens are. We can draw there's certainly likely to be people in the community who are having similar experiences here. Should they exist? We need to think about this. We need to think about elements of social justice in the way that Wayne described this morning. So, to conclude, effective reading comprehension development involves teacher knowledge and understanding of key inferences and reading comprehension strategies, deployment of a well-researched pedagogical approach, a repertoire of teacher talk, and Fiona will talk about that later today. But it's about scaffolding the learners through discussion and dialogue, and the questions are the starting point for discussion and dialogue. They are not just 3 questions for children to write an answer to. They're there to develop those key types of inference making, and we do that in the context of choosing engaging and challenging texts. Thank you very much. And that's where I'm going to stop.